The first thing Marin Solis noticed about the Veth was that they didn't breathe. Not the way she understood breathing. Their thoracic plates expanded in a slow tidal rhythm. Every 40 seconds or so, a long pull of processed atmosphere, and between each expansion they were perfectly, terrifyingly still. She had clocked it during the first 16 hours of captivity, lying flat on her back in the dark, counting heartbeats that weren't hers. It was the only thing she had left to count. The facility they'd taken her to was called a survey station in the official Veth communication packages. What it actually was, Marin had figured out in roughly 3 hours, was a pressure cage sunk 9 kilometers into the mantle of a geologically active moon. The Veth used it to study the interior of worlds before they committed to extraction. You didn't strip mine a planet's core blindly. You sent instruments first. Then, apparently, you sent a xenogeologist from New Reykjavik who had been in the wrong survey cave at the wrong moment. Her name appeared in no treaty. The Veth had not violated any formal accord by taking her. They had simply picked her up the way you might pick up a piece of local rock. For study, for reference, because she was there. She had been there because of Dave. Her brother's field notes were still in her jacket pocket, folded into the inner breast panel, where she'd put them the morning she left the settlement. 41 pages of compressed handwriting, geological survey data for the moon's lower lithosphere, observations from a descent that nobody at the settlement administration had been willing to fund for the follow-up expedition. Dav had gone down alone 18 months ago and come back with data that should have changed everything. Instead, the administration had quietly shelved his findings, and Dav had gone back to the surface surveys. Quieter than before, the way a man goes quiet when he stops expecting to be believed. Then he'd gone missing on a routine magnetometer pass. The notes he'd left her were annotated with locations, coordinates, and a single sentence at the bottom of the last page, in the cramped shorthand he'd used since they were children. "Come look. I found something, and I don't think we're supposed to know about it." She'd been 3 kilometers into the survey cave. Following the second coordinate, headlamp cutting through a forest of calcite formations that glowed faint gold in the light. When the Veth retrieval team found her, they had not hurt her. That was the detail she kept returning to in the dark. They had not hurt her, but they had taken everything. Her pack, her instruments, her comm unit, and placed her in a chamber that was warm enough to keep a human alive, pressurized correctly, atmospherically tolerable. They had been methodical about her survival. This was somehow worse than cruelty. Cruelty would have meant, Shia mattered. Being kept alive with the same careful indifference you'd apply to a biological sample meant she didn't. On the third day, she found the crack. It was behind the curved section of the chamber wall, invisible unless you pressed your face close and tilted the light at the right angle. A fracture in the composite paneling, no wider than 2 fingers, running from floor height to somewhere above her head in the dark. Beyond it, warmth, moving air, the faint mineral smell of deep rock, which she had loved since she was 11 years old, and her brother had first taken her caving on Earth. Marin lay on her back and thought about it for a long time. The Veth were not cruel. They were also not imaginative, as far as she had been able to determine. Their facility was built to specification. Everything standardized, everything optimized. They had not anticipated that the xenogeologist they'd picked up would be carrying 41 pages of her brother's notes on the local lithosphere, or that she had spent the last 12 years of her career learning to read rock the way other people read faces. She pressed her back against the wall opposite the crack and thought about Dav, about his handwriting in the margins of the third coordinate page. Magnetite seams running NNW from survey point, natural convection channels, the kind of geothermal circulation that shouldn't exist at this depth unless something is venting upward. She got up and started looking for anything she could use as a lever. What she found was the support strut from one of the environmental monitoring stations they'd left in her cell. A meter-long piece of alloy extrusion, probably never meant to be removable, but the mounting bracket had been installed by a Veth technician who had calculated tolerances for Veth physiology, not for a 165-centimeter woman who'd spent 2 years doing core sampling in high-pressure environments and had forearm strength that had surprised 3 separate arm wrestling partners at the New Reykjavik Geology Department mixer. The bracket gave on the 4th attempt. She sat down on the floor afterward and laughed once, sharp and surprised, and then covered her mouth with her hand because even down here, 9 kilometers into a moon's mantle, old habits held. She worked on the crack for 6 hours. The composite paneling was not designed to be breached from the inside. It was also not designed for someone who had nothing else to do, no other options, and a very specific kind of stubbornness that her mother had called the family curse, and her brother had called the family superpower, depending on what mood he was in. Marin wedged the strut into the fracture and levered methodically, resting when her arms gave out, returning when they recovered. The crack widened by millimeters, then by centimeters. Then, in one long grinding moment that sent a spike of terror through her at the noise it made, the panel bowed outward and broke along an internal seam, and the moving air hit her face like cold water. She squeezed through into darkness. The space beyond was natural, formed rock, not Veth construction. The floor sloped downward at maybe 15 degrees, and the air moved past her with deliberate intent, drawn by some pressure differential lower in the system. She turned her headlamp on. She still had her headlamp. They had taken everything except what was in her jacket, and she had bought this particular jacket in part because of the internal pocket design, which could hold a folded survey lamp, a compressed water filter, 2 emergency ration bars, and 41 pages of her dead brother's field notes. She stood in the beam of her own light and looked at the rock, layered basalt with magnetite intrusions, exactly as Dav had described. The seams ran NNW, the air moved NNW. She pulled out the notes and read the 3rd coordinate entry again, cross-referencing it with what she could see, and something in her chest that had been wound very tight for 72 hours loosened by one precise notch. Dav, she thought. You brilliant paranoid man, she went down. The Veth discovered she was missing at the 6-hour mark. She counted the interval by the sound of their activity above her, transmitted through the rock in low harmonic vibrations that her body registered more than her ears. They were not panicking. The Veth did not panic. But there was a change in the quality of the facility's sounds. More movement, more mechanical actuation, the deep bass note of heavy doors cycling. She was, by that point, well below their retrieval range. The geology told a story as she descended. Dav had read it first, and she was reading it now, his notes in one hand and her headlamp in the other, moving through a world that had no right to be as beautiful as it was. The magnetite seams glowed faint violet under her lamp's UV setting, a trick she'd learned from Dave, who'd learned it from their father, who had been a mining engineer on 3 different worlds and who had died believing the universe was fundamentally legible if you knew how to look at it. The natural convection channels widened as she descended, the rock walls, smoothing where superheated fluid had moved through them for millions of years. She found the first evidence of her brother at the 4-kilometer mark. A camp marker, the kind of low-profile ceramic stake that field geologists used to tag sites, nearly invisible unless you knew to look for the color-banded cap. Dave's survey color was blue-gold. She crouched next to it and pressed her fingers against the cool ceramic, and did not let herself stop moving for more than 30 seconds. The second marker was 500 meters further down. The third was at the edge of what the survey notes called the transition zone, which turned out to be an accurate name for a place where the tunnel opened without warning into a space so vast that her headlamp beam died before it reached the far wall. She stood at the edge of it and breathed below her light. Not artificial light, bioluminescent light, the slow cold glow of chemosynthetic organisms distributed across a subterranean ecosystem that occupied a chamber roughly the size of a small city. The magnetite seams were everywhere here, threading through the ceiling rock in veins that pulsed faintly when she touched them. Some geologic stress was moving through the formation, regular as breathing, and the magnetite seams sang with it. It was not the center of the moon, it was something stranger, a place where the moon's internal mechanics had created conditions for life. Warmth and mineral richness and isolated stability, hundreds of millions of years undisturbed. Until Marin thought, until the Veth survey team had arrived and started drilling down from above. She understood what Dav had found. She understood why the administration had shelved his report. Someone had told them to. She stood at the edge of the transition zone and thought about that, and thought about the Veth facility 9 kilometers above her, and thought about what it meant that a xenogeology survey had been officially filed, officially buried, and that the geologist who'd filed it had subsequently gone missing. Then she stopped thinking about it, because thinking about it was a luxury, and she needed to move. She climbed down into the light. The ecosystem at the bottom of the transition zone had never seen a human being. This was clear from the way everything in it reacted to her. Not with fear, exactly, but with a kind of urgent recalibration, organisms adjusting their behavior to account for a new variable. Bioluminescent organisms in the rock walls brightened as she passed. Something in the middle distance made a sound like a finger drawn across a crystal glass and then went silent. She found her brother's camp in a hollow between two magnetite formations. He had been there. The evidence was unmistakable. The orderly arrangement of sample containers, the field journal in its waterproof case, the small cook unit still holding a sealed ration pack. She opened the journal with hands that were not quite steady. The last entry was dated 43 days ago. Found the main chamber, Dav had written. The Veth survey team broke through the ceiling at the north end 3 days ago. They don't know I'm here. They're sampling systematically. I've been watching their extraction drones for 2 days. Whatever they're here for, it isn't the ecosystem. They're after the magnetite concentration at the core of the formation. If they drill for extraction, the pressure system that maintains this whole chamber collapses. Everything here goes with it. I've been trying to reach Marin. Comms are blocked. Something the Veth are doing, or the rock depth, or both. I'm going to try to move laterally to find a gap in the interference. If she reads this before she finds me, the extraction drill they've sighted is positioned in the primary pressure arch. The arch is the keystone of the whole formation. You don't need much to destabilize it. A gram of the right compound in the right crack would do it. Not a collapse. A pressure release, upward. Like uncorking a bottle, the Veth facility is directly above the arch. I'm sorry, Mar. I'm sorry I left the notes. I should have known you'd follow. She read the entry twice. Then she folded the journal carefully, tucked it against her own notes in the inside pocket, and sat very still for a moment in the bioluminescent light. A gram of the right compound. She didn't have the right compound. She had 2 ration bars, a water filter, a UV lamp, and an alloy strut from a Veth environmental monitor. She also had 12 years of experience with high-pressure geothermal systems and a working understanding of stress fracture propagation in magnetite-bearing basalt. And she had Dave's survey data, which was extremely precise about the location of the primary pressure arch and the orientation of its load-bearing strata. She thought about what she did have. She thought about it for a while. Then she started moving again. The primary pressure arch was identifiable from a kilometer away if you knew what you were looking at. It was a graceful thing, 200 meters of curved basalt spanning a subsurface void, held in compression by the weight of everything above it and the upward pressure of the geothermal system below. It had been stable for, she estimated, 60 to 70 million years. The magnetite deposits concentrated in its base were what the Veth extraction drones were after. She found the extraction site with 4 hours remaining. 4 hours before the Veth's drill was scheduled to reach extraction depth. According to the drilling timeline she'd pieced together from Dave's observations, and the harmonic vibrations she'd been tracking through the rock, the drill casing was Veth engineering. Modular, precise design to tolerances that assumed the surrounding geology was inert. It was not designed to account for a fracture propagation from an unanticipated direction, specifically from the lateral stress accumulation point that Dav had marked on his survey map with a small star and the annotation, "Do not stand here during tremor activity." Marin stood at the stress accumulation point and looked at the drill casing and thought about the alloy strut in her hand. Then she thought about Dav. Then she stopped thinking and started working. The strut was not the right tool. The right tool would have been a shaped charge, or a hydraulic spreader, or any of the instruments currently sitting in her confiscated field pack 9 kilometers above her. What she had was a meter of alloy extrusion and a very accurate sense of where to put it. She found the spot by touch, the way Dav had taught her. Not with your eyes, Mar, with your palms. Feel where the rock is holding tension, feel where it wants to give. The magnetite seam at the base of the arch was singing under her hands, a vibration she felt in her sternum. She positioned the strut. She looked at what she was about to do. Once she did this, the pressure release would propagate upward through the formation in approximately 4 to 6 minutes, based on the fracture characteristics of the surrounding rock. The Veth facility above would lose its structural foundation. It was not designed for that. Nothing above the arch would be where it was when she started. She thought about the Veth technicians. She thought about them the way you think about something you have to be honest with yourself about. Methodically, without flinching. They were not monsters. They had kept her alive with careful indifference, and they were going to destroy an ecosystem of incalculable biological value, because they had calculated that its substrate was worth more in raw materials than the organisms living in it. They were in some essential way not wrong by their own math. But she was going to do this anyway. She thought about her father, who had died believing the universe was legible. She thought about her brother's handwriting in the margins. "Come look. I found something." She positioned her weight behind the strut. She hummed very quietly the geology field song that her university cohort had sung during the practicals. A stupid, tuneless thing that had no business being comforting, and was anyway. She pushed. The fracture propagated exactly where Dav's survey said it would. The sound was not an explosion. It was a long, resonant crack, the tone of it rising as the stress released, followed by a deep percussion as the pressure system found its new path. Upward, through the drill channel, through the magnetite formation, through 9 kilometers of moon rock, through the floor of a Veth survey station that had been built without accounting for a variable it had never considered. The ecosystem chamber flexed. The bioluminescent organisms brightened to something close to sunlight. Something in the far dark made the crystal glass sound again, and this time held it. Marin was moving before the echo finished. She had 4 minutes, maybe 5, before the secondary pressure wave came back down. She ran with her headlamp bouncing, and Dave's journal against her ribs, and the field song still running somewhere in the back of her head. And she was thinking about the 4th coordinate in his notes, the one she hadn't reached yet, and what he had written next to it. Secondary convection channel. Runs lateral to the main system, exits at the moon's eastern terminator zone. Exits, she found it where the notes said it would be, a passage narrow enough that she had to remove her jacket and push it ahead of her, moving through rock that was warm to the touch and vibrating with the aftershocks of what she'd set in motion above. The convection channel rose. She climbed. Above her, she knew the Veth facility was going. Not destroyed. The pressure release was a venting event, not a collapse. Exactly as Dave had calculated. But the structural compromise would trigger every emergency protocol in a Veth installation. Evacuation, full withdrawal, documentation of an unstable survey site, filed and archived, unsuitable for extraction operations. The ecosystem below would remain. The drill would not return. She climbed for 3 hours. The rock narrowed and widened, and the air moved past her with increasing urgency, and the warmth increased, and then suddenly, between one hand placement and the next, she was looking at stars. Not many stars. A crack in the moon's surface barely wide enough for her shoulders, opening onto the thin dark of the moon's night side. She lay in it with her face in the cold open air and laughed until she couldn't, and then was quiet, and then laughed again. She calculated, approximately 43 kilometers from the nearest settlement access point. She had 2 ration bars and functional boots, and a very detailed set of field notes. The Veth would be filing their incident report for weeks. Whatever communication blackout they'd been running over this region would have died with the facility's primary systems. She pulled out her comm unit, still inoperative, still deep in interference, and looked at it, and then looked at the stars. Then she started walking. She had gone maybe 2 kilometers when her comm unit beeped twice, struggled, and connected. The voice that came through was static heavy and disbelieving and completely unmistakable. "Mar?" She stopped walking. She stood in the cold dark of the moon's surface and felt the geological survey notes pressing against her ribs and the ration bar in her jacket pocket, and the aftershock vibration still running faintly through the soles of her boots from 9 kilometers below. "Yes," she said. "It's me." A pause. She could hear him breathing, the right kind of breathing, ragged with relief. "I found the secondary channel," she said. "You were right about the pressure arch." Another pause. When Dave spoke again, his voice was doing something complicated. "The facility, gone, not collapsed, compromised. They won't come back." Silence. "Dav," she said. "Your math was perfect." She heard him exhale, a long, unsteady sound that had 12 years of being not believed behind it, 18 months of a shelved report, 43 days underground, and whatever he'd been through to get to wherever he was. "Okay," he said finally quietly. "Tell me where you are," she said. "I'll find you." She resumed walking. The stars above her were the same stars she'd grown up under. The same stars her father had named for her when she was small. The same stars that had been there before the Veth arrived, and would be there after. The moon's rock was cold and hard under her feet, and she knew it. Knew what was beneath it, what had been preserved beneath it, what had been saved, and knowing it felt like something she intended to carry for a long time. She walked, and the comm line stayed open, and somewhere 40 kilometers away, her brother was also walking, toward her, through the dark.